For those of you who are new to the Freie Universität and or at least to the Osteuropa-Institut, I think I have met some of you in my seminars, at least I recognize some of the faces, but definitely not everybody. My name is Alexander Libman and I am Professor of Russian East European Politics at the Freie Universität Berlin. And as you know, we agreed this semester to organize this Grundlagenvorlesung in a somewhat different format. It was done before at our institute. So rather to immediately jump into a specific topic, which is in this year, to my knowledge, related to migration, we agreed that at the beginning, 5 disciplinary, or roughly at the beginning, it's spread over the first month, the 5 disciplinary chairs will present to you the research and the topical foci they are working at, so that you have an idea about what is driving each of our units. And this is exactly what I want to do. And therefore, we are going to talk about the fundamentals of our research, that is the authoritarian political regimes in the post-Soviet Eurasia. As you know, political science at Eastern European Studies Institute is essentially research of authoritarian regimes and primarily quantitative research of authoritarian regimes and rational choice research of authoritarian regimes. And this is exactly the perspective which I'm going to present to you now. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to engage in the conversation with you for about 1 hour and 15 minutes, possibly with some interruptions in terms of my questions to you and your questions to me. And then we'll have time for questions. Please, however, whatever remarks, comments, or questions you have, raise your hands and intervene at any moment. I'm happy to answer them. All right? If there are no questions now, let me immediately jump into the topic. Now, I told you Eastern European Studies Institute, political science, study of authoritarianism. This is not a coincidence. In the last 10 to 15 years, there have been substantial progress in research on authoritarian regimes in political science and in the Eastern European region, in particular post-Soviet Eurasia, and even more particular Russia. Russia was and remains the key example of this research. Has played a crucial role in the advancement of a new generation of theoretical approaches and arguments dealing with authoritarian regimes. And as a matter of fact, modern view on authoritarian regimes is to a large extent informed by the Eurasian case, in particular by the Russian case. So from this point of view, it is interesting to understand how the dynamics of these countries, not just Russia, Kazakhstan, you'll see, is also very important, influence the view of political science and authoritarianism. What is also important, the way how political science discussed authoritarian regimes is currently under pressure. So we had this major advancement of new generation of theories in the last 15 years, and then we have a major criticism of the theories, again, in the last couple of years, and again, a big part of this criticism comes from studying post-Soviet region, comes from studying Russia, comes from studying other countries of this part of the world. So, if you want, Eurasian case was definitive for how we think about authoritarian regimes today. It was also definitive for how we are unhappy thinking about authoritarian regimes today. And you can immediately imagine the major reason for this challenge. The full-scale war in Ukraine was an important event which the way of research on authoritarianism as it existed before 2022 had hard time dealing with and hard time analyzing. So this is exactly what I'm going to do in my talk today. I'm going to, first of all, summarize how Russian and Eurasian experience influenced our view on authoritarianism, and then talk about what went wrong and how we try to think about consequences of this developments and what they mean for us. The starting point of course, a definition. And I mean, some of you are in my seminar on interdisciplinary research on authoritarian regimes, so you have heard these definitions already. You don't need to go through this again. Some of you are not, and therefore have not heard these definitions. So if we want to talk about authoritarianism, we need to agree what authoritarianism actually is. And this is not such an easy question as it appears to be. Because in minds of most observers of authoritarian regimes, both people who just think about authoritarianism, try to imagine authoritarian regimes working, but also scholars until a certain moment of time, one of these two figures typically occurred. Do you know who this guy is? He is not from the post-Soviet Eurasia, but still a very paradigmatic. I quite consciously chose this guy to be placed on the slide. So who is it?
Is it Pinochet?
No, but close. It's Tresna. So a classical example of one way of thinking about authoritarianism, Latin American dictatorships. Absolute control in the hands of one person or a very small group of people, junta, exercised through systematic political repressions. So a big part of modern research on authoritarianism started from this setting. Who are these gentlemen here? You see by the enthusiastic faces and overall mood of the picture, you could imagine who they are.
Central Party Committee.
Politburo of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Exactly. That's another way how a lot of people thought about authoritarianism until recently. That was the view on authoritarian regimes as party states. Party states which we observed in the communist bloc, which we still observe in China, the idea of highly institutionalized, formalized authoritarian regimes, which are able to reproduce their power but rely on very particular and well-developed ideology. So, each of these pictures has a certain idea of authoritarianism behind that. One person rule, uncontrolled and unconstrained violence here, mass repressions, high ideologization of the whole society, and more or less formalized institutional rules here. The problem is, of course, that either one of these pictures reflect only one specific variety of authoritarian regimes, and none of them actually reflects the variety of authoritarian regimes we have today in the post-Soviet Eurasia. So not just any of them, none of them is in any way related to this. You will see no post-Soviet leaders who look like Stresna. Actually, Putin and Lukashenko occasionally also like to wear a military uniform, but will not look as natural in it as their Latin American counterpart. And you will not have this gloomy assembly of Politburo in any of the countries. In any of them, you'll ultimately have a highly personalist regime with one president on top. And this is the reason, actually, why post-Soviet Eurasia was so important. Because it was a very clear and paradigmatic example of how authoritarianism could work differently from the common conceptions. Not the only example. China played an important role for a different type of research on the so-called institutional autocracies. Or there was some work which was derived from the Middle East and Africa, but post-Soviet Eurasia actually was among the key examples, which is also the reason why political science working on Russia and post-Soviet Eurasia, unlike its predecessors for the last forever, actually, is or was before 2022 in the mainstream in political science. So it was not a marginal area or a fringe area like Sovietology, which had limited communication with the mainline discipline. It is part of the mainline discipline, a very important one. In terms of methods, in terms of theories, and in terms of toolbox it applies. Still, I haven't given you the definition of authoritarian regimes, so let me do it now. The problem with this definition is it's a negative one. Authoritarian regimes are not defined in modern political science for what they are defined for what they are not. they are not electoral democracies. Okay, what are electoral democracies? These are systems in which there is a possibility and actually regularly occurring power change through free and fair elections. If any of these components is absent, you have an authoritarian regime. If there is no election whatsoever, it's an authoritarian regime. Or autocracy. In the language of political science, it's the same. In history, it's not. If you have elections, but they're not free and fair, it's authoritarian regime. If you have elections, they are kind of free and fair, but they don't change anything because the same people stay in power, that's again an authoritarian regime. And you notice that if I apply this definition, I immediately will include enormous variety of different regimes and systems into the category of authoritarianism. Vatican would be an authoritarian regime. They obviously don't have free and fair elections through which the power changes. Iran would be an authoritarian regime for sure, although actually they have elections with some level of competitiveness. So the boundary of authoritarianism in this case is clear, but authoritarianism appears not like a clear counterpart to democracy, but rather like a messy assembly of different types of political systems, very often very, very different from each other. There is an old joke which I have already told in one of my seminars, so some of you will know it. Authoritarian regimes are like non-elephant animals. Yeah? I mean, it actually comes from mathematics. Non-linear function is a non-elephant animal. Is it helpful to know that an animal is not an elephant? Certainly is, but the range of what this animal can be is still relatively large, I would say. So, what we know about authoritarian regimes, they are not electoral democracies. But we don't know so much else. And that's exactly what the research in authoritarian regimes is trying to find out. Maybe one important comment, I quite consciously use the word electoral and not liberal democracies. Okay? Liberal democracy is a much more demanding concept. It would include things like human rights, protections of minorities, possibly checks and balances. This all you can also use. But the definition of authoritarianism typically focuses on the minimalistic electoral aspects because they're easier to measure. Everything else is debatable, disputable, and to everything else there are tons of exceptions. But for elections, it's more or less clear, although there are also question marks. And from this point of view, regimes which evolved in the post-Soviet Eurasia after the fall of the Soviet Union are in most cases are authoritarian. They don't have free and fair elections, or the power doesn't change through those. But at the same time, very different from these two pictures. So what are the characteristics of these regimes? And I will specifically focus on Russia first, and then towards the end, I'll talk about other typical Eurasian authoritarian regimes. Belarus, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. One could also include in this list Kyrgyzstan, which had authoritarian episodes and democratic episodes, and one probably needs to at least mention Georgia, although I would not call it authoritarian, at least not authoritarian yet, but I have to mention it. There have been authoritarian tendencies in countries like Ukraine, Moldova, or Armenia. But if you look at my electoral criteria, none of them really cross the threshold. So, let's start with Russia then. If we look at Putinism as it existed before full-scale invasion, we'll observe at least some features which will be very different from both Latin American dictatorship and party state of the Soviet or Chinese type. Differently from party state, Putinism will have extremely low level of ideologization. Essentially, ideology which Putinism for decades used was, I'm leaving you guys alone and please allow me to maintain control over the country. Which is actually the reason why we have a major debate about whether there is any ideology of Putin's regime at all. Today, there are more people who will say yes to that than it was 4 years ago. But nevertheless, there is, even today, nothing what we could describe as an encompassing, systematic, ideological structure similar to the Soviet one. Madeleine Laruelle has, I think, a very nice way of thinking about ideology of Putin's regime, and according to her conceptualization, we need to distinguish between two things. What does exist in Putin regime is some sort of fundamental beliefs of elites in Putin personally. These fundamental beliefs are very general. They don't suffice to formulate a clear and coherent ideology, but they do exist. They're shared by a big part of the political class. Things like sovereignty of Russia is very important, or Russia is going to remain a great power. So, if for you the existence of these beliefs suffices to talk about ideology, then you can say there is an ideology. But for most, it would not. On the other hand, argues Laruelle, there exists what she calls a broad market of ideological entrepreneurs. And these are people who actually have this systematic sets of beliefs, or at least are willing to develop them. From infamous Dugin, who is the most colorful of them all, to a large number of people inventing and reinventing different ways to think about, well, why the things Russian political elites believe anyway in are correct. So, some of them would be conservatives. That's what Katharina Blum is working at. Some of them would define themselves through Orthodox faith or their interpretation of Orthodox faith, and would present Russia as a katechon. This is the word from the Orthodox theology, the last bastion against Antichrist. Some of them would focus on classical nationalism. Some of them would actually focus on markets and self-actualization of individuals. This is also part of what Putin uses. Putin actually is a big fan of the word competition, free and fair competition, and actually argues that the big problem of Europeans and Americans that they are afraid of free and fair competition, which Russia is not afraid of. Which is one of the reasons why in Russia antitrust was actually much more powerful than in similar systems. So, in any case, we have this market of ideas for which Putinism can draw individuals, or at least we had this markets of ideas before 2022. But this is not how the traditional party states of the Soviet style look like. There is relatively low level of repressions until 2022. You would find dozens, maybe hundreds of political convicts in Russia during this era. You would find individual cases of political assassinations, but for most Russians during this period, the level of repressions was very low, and those who stayed away from politics, which is the absolute majority, didn't experience any at all. Again, very different from actually this time not only party state, but also Latin American dictatorship. On top to that, Latin American dictatorship, of course, works without any reference to law. Just black squadrons come to somebody at night and make people disappear. Putin's system works with excruciating formalism. So nobody's disappearing. Everybody is judged by the law. The law is highly questionable, to say the least, but there is law. Putin is, by the way, very proud of that, pointing out that he is following the law. Yeah? The letter of the law, not the spirit, but nevertheless. There are regular elections. These regular elections continue even after the full-scale invasion. These regular elections are, well, at least formally elections. That's not the Soviet ritual, when you come to the ballot box, take a piece of paper and throw it in the ballot box and go home. There is a multiplicity of political parties. Some of them actually at some elections cannot really explain why they compete with Putin, because they find him great. But nevertheless, they're there. And these elections are, of course, controlled by the state, but there is still some sort of variation going on. And at the regional level, there have been even episodes of not the candidates of the Kremlin winning the elections. What happened later to these guys is a different story. So, and these elections happen all regularly, are extremely costly for the regime to organize, and the regime still continues using them. These elections are massively manipulated. The extent of electoral manipulation in Russia is actually very well researched, but nevertheless they're there. And finally, until 2022, Putin's regime massively benefited from the country's openness to global economy. The regime didn't introduce any systematic constraints on immigration. Actually, they don't exist even today. Unless some groups which are really constrained in leaving Russia, for everybody else, if you want to go, you can go. Very different from party states, very different from many other historical examples. The regime was eager to engage in economic relations with whoever wanted to engage in relations with the regime, and obviously didn't fear that, as opposed to many other authoritarian regimes of the past. So actually all these characteristics I'm talking about now are the reasons why it is debatable when exactly Russia became authoritarian after 1991. There is a really big divergence of points of view on that from those who say that Russia was authoritarian from the day one, which is today a much more popular point of view than some time ago, to the point of view that real authoritarianism in Russia starts only in 2012. And the reason for this variation is precisely this criterion of free and fair elections to which power can change. First of all, where exactly is the boundary under which elections are clearly not free and fair? And second, where exactly is the boundary under which we know that power is not going to change after the elections? In 1996, Boris Yeltsin competed against Gennady Zyuganov. Most Western observers at that moment of time would call Russia imperfect democracy or something like this. Most Western politicians, all Western politicians, would call Russia imperfect democracy at that moment of time. We are very well aware of the fact that in the administration of Boris Yeltsin, there were voices and non-negligible voices which said that if we're going to lose, we're certainly not going to give away power to Zyuganov. Yeah? If we say these voices are relevant, Russia was not a democracy back then. It was an autocracy, by definition, okay? If we say, well, these voices are not so relevant, then you could say Russia was a democracy. And ultimately, we have never had a litmus test for this because Yeltsin won. One of the reasons why this confusion exists, and I'm going to repeat it times and again in this class, for many, the notion of authoritarianism is not a system characteristic, but a value judgment. Authoritarian regimes are not regimes run by certain mechanisms, through certain logic. Authoritarian regimes are regimes run by nasty guys, whom we really don't like. And in 1996, we, and I think with very good reasons, disliked Gennady Zyuganov much more than Boris Yeltsin. Yeah? Can be true. It still doesn't change the fact that democracy is not a system of honest and decent statespeople operating in the interests of the society. Actually, there is a system which I've described now, it's called utopia. Oh, no, there isn't actually, but if it were, it would be utopia. The only difference between democracy and autocracy are mechanisms through which decisions are made. And from this point of view, the fact that one nasty person in the Kremlin organizes elections in a way for which an even nastier guy doesn't come to power has nothing to do with democracy. But that was not the view at that moment of time, and at that moment of time, the concerns about communists coming back to power in Russia were for most much more important than what happens with the Russian elections. So, we have a system in which elections regularly take place, although they are manipulated. They look like elections, and we have a system with relatively low level of ideologization and very low level of repressiveness. And precisely these two observations about Russian political case gave rise to probably two most prominent theoretical concepts used in political science today to describe authoritarian regimes: electoral authoritarianism and informational authoritarianism. These concepts are not just theoretical, they're constantly used in public debate. So if I may ask, for those who are not in my seminar, because guys, you know that, at least I hope so, who of you is familiar with the concept of electoral authoritarianism? Okay, with informational? Somewhat. Does somebody want to define electoral authoritarianism for us? Again, except people who are in my seminar. Does somebody want to try? Actually, definition is almost there, but maybe just to sum it up.
I mean, like, you have organized by the state mechanism, by one party, or I would say like by one like small state elite group, and different parties are like accepted, so-called like bloc parties or spoiler parties, and these parties are in reality they don't like they can't like change the government, like they can't like bring down the government because they're just like puppets somehow. I mean, they can, for example, in Russia, like the leader of the LDPR can say, okay, we need to limit the migration, and can say that to Putin, and Putin then says, okay, we're going to do it somehow, but he can't say like, okay, good, marching into Ukraine was a big mistake. We should make like negotiations with the West. So that's like, or we should like give back Crimea to Ukraine. Then I think then he would be, I would say, like shot, or he would go to prison.
I mean, there was a lot in what you have said, and some of this indeed would fit the definition of electoral authoritarianism, but some would probably not. Somebody else? Yes, please?
I would guess it's where elections are used as a way where the state tries to legitimize themselves to their own people. It's kind of maybe it's strong to say it's part of brainwashing, but I would argue that it is. Like where you try and imply, oh, everyone living here has a voice, they have a chance to take part in our, having a say in what society should be like, but you can only say that society should be one particular way, really. And it's not going to change anything. It's just a way where they can, how on the Western news, like when the Russian elections were happening, there were these pictures of, here are the people who could replace Putin. I mean, we actually thought that was going to happen. But it's a way to outwardly and inwardly try and legitimize the authoritarian power that is in place.
This is absolutely correct. So yeah, you're 100% right. This is in fact one of the main reasons why electoral authoritarianism exists.
And keeping tabs on people.
But let's just make a step back. So you already told us what is beneficial for the regime in terms of this system. But let's first define it, just to be sure that we know what we're talking about. And I think we all agreed electoral authoritarianism is defined through elections. There are elections. And that's not enough. You need to say something else.
Well, elections with different available parties that you can vote for, like legitimate parties parties that do actually exist, and people that are actually representing those parties.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a bit what I wanted to say. It's elections that should not challenge the regime, but that are not only symbolic, like in party regime.
I think that's the best definition we could have. But yes, please.
And if you're asking about the cause, there is a perception that there should be a free speech. That's why there should be some representatives of those free speech regions. And those issues, like in the system, we also like even a vote, maybe. Yeah.
Excellent. So now we have all the bits and pieces. I think, first of all, we have a definition. It is a system where you A, have elections, B, these elections are not purely symbolic. That was what I didn't like in the beginning in our discussion, because it looked like elections are purely symbolic in your definition, right? No, if you have purely symbolic elections, there can be one party, like in the Soviet Union, there can be 5 parties, like at one moment of time in Uzbekistan. That has nothing to do with elections, with electoral authoritarianism. In this case, you still use elections, but you don't use them like electoral authoritarian regimes would do. B, elections are, although they're a bit competitive, not really giving a possibility to change the person in power. If the person in power can change, that's a democracy. And originally, when people encountered this type of regimes, they appeared to them like a sort of intermediary step. Either, and that was their view in the optimistic 90s, intermediary step towards democracy. So we have elections, there is competition, some things are not so well, but maybe it's not a big problem because anyway, great Democrat Boris Yeltsin is winning and communists are losing, so we can close one eye. But over the time, we'll have good democratic elections, so everything will be fine. That was the reason why these type of regimes were originally called even democracies with adjectives or even hybrid regimes. Today we know they're authoritarian. And this is what people try to do today in the debate about these regimes, they try to understand what the benefits for an authoritarian regime could be to engage in this electoral charade. And I think the first benefit you have mentioned, legitimacy. We live in a world in which democracy is the only game in town. Putin knowingly described himself as a great democrat. So it's kind of not so nice to just abolish the parliament like in the age of Stresna. Or the early Soviets, when you say, we don't believe in this bourgeois democracy, we do things our way. Today you need to imitate something that looks like a democratic system. Yes, please?
Yes, it was about information acquisition.
Perfect. That's the second reason. The second reason is the fact that these elections are a bit competitive allows the regime to acquire information about what people like and dislike. If in one particular year a certain candidate from actually a regime-loyal liberal democratic party suddenly wins elections of the governor in one of the Russian Far East regions, Khabarovsk, although he was not scheduled to win there, that tells you something about the state of the mind in the Far East. You better find it out this way than when people are standing on the streets before Kremlin. Yeah? There is actually the third reason why electoral authoritarianism exists in Russia, and this is a reason which is not so much at the core of political science scholarship, because we like rational choice explanations and things which people do on purpose, but in many cases electoral authoritarianism is just a legacy. Russia emerged out of the state of the 1990s when having elections was, well, you cannot be a pro-Western growing democracy with the president invited to Big 8 if you don't have elections. That looks like what a country which the West wants to deal with. And also, you cannot ignore elections if your own people believe that's the way to run the country. And then over time, you slowly but surely go away from this, but you still keep elections because they always had elections. So if you want, bureaucratic inertia is sometimes even better explanation for things than conscious institutional design. Nevertheless, electoral authoritarianism in Eurasia was seen as a very powerful and very effective tool of control over people. Authoritarian regimes managed to rule without massive repressions, merely through electoral manipulations. And as long as it was not quite clear whether the electoral manipulations were large enough so that without electoral manipulations a power change would have occurred, people could kind of swallow it. Things become different if power change does occur, would have occurred without electoral manipulation. So the case of Belarus in 2020 is particularly important here, where for most people it was clear that Lukashenko lost the elections. But as long as it doesn't happen, for example, in Russia, never happened yet. These systems are quite helpful in terms of legitimacy and in terms of provision of information. Now, these systems tell us nothing about something else which is important for some authoritarian regimes. And here I would have to leave the post-Soviet case and move towards China. They tell us nothing about division of power. Another big strand of research in modern political science looks at the conditions under which authoritarian regimes delegate some power to other actors. This is, however, not the post-Soviet case. So I'm just mentioning it here without engaging in further discussion. Okay, informational authoritarianism. What is informational authoritarianism? Again, the definition is kind of on the slide, but we still have to make it more precise. That's a more recent concept. Electoral authoritarianism was very established. The book on informational authoritarianism was published in 2022, Spin Dictatorship by Guriev and Treisman, in the year where they already had the necessity to explain why Russia is not an informational authoritarian regime. But nevertheless, what is informational authoritarianism? What could it be? Somebody wants to try? It's certainly less intuitive than electoral authoritarianism, right? Sure, go on.
Well, it seems like it is very much tied to well, it says manipulating the core beliefs of, I would guess subject refers to people living in the country, not like countries around them, and thus keeping them from wanting to rebel in the first place. So you don't even need to suppress any sort of dissent because the people already believe that the country they're living in is good, which I would think the Soviet Union kind of already did that.
Exactly, and that's the problem. And Soviet Union is not an electoral authoritarianism. Not an informational authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, you're right, it's all about propaganda, convincing people in certain things that people have to believe in.
As far as I believe, there is also this thing that people don't really think that their leader is the best, but they think he's as bad as everyone else.
As bad as everyone out there?
And thus people don't really think that there is a need for change because, you know, in Russia say, you know, I'm out of politics, I can change it.
Mm-hmm.
So people are getting depoliticized also.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Those regime keeps us stability because no one wants to protest. No one cares.
Mm-hmm. Yes, please?
And people are not really involved in politics just because they do not receive much information and some scandals or something are just getting the information from the real problems. And that's how government tries to make a certain leading point as we do have in Kazakhstan, we do not have a war. That's really good, and we do not have to we have to be fine with that.
Yes, please?
I would say like it's a bit like in Portugal under this
Salazar.
Salazar, because like Salazar, he somehow didn't have a big ideology.
Actually, he did.
Or like or I would say like he didn't have like a code of personality so much around him. He was more like a person who kept out like the politics and everything out of the society, and he was more like relying on something. And like politics is like completely kept out from society. So there's just like the feeling to like not have the feeling of living in a, I would say, totalitarian or very restricted society. So like for example, you can like go out and I don't know, like you can go out and go and watch movies, although these movies might be like I would say like restricted content or like forbidden content, as long as you don't like form a big movement against like the government, I would say. Like I mean, like in Russia, for example, it was also like possible to read before the war Novaya Gazeta, and you weren't like arrested as a like individual person somehow. In some cases, I don't know, but I think not.
And also, like to add up to the others, maybe some form of restricting migration, or maybe the lower income thing that people can just travel to other countries and see how different it is in different places. And maybe the thing with rewriting history, historical narratives in the school. And maybe a bit of restricting internet by like providing more complex methods to find the new information.
I think yes, you, and then you. Yes, please. Or
me?
Yeah.
Because you before said that the Soviet Union was not an informational authoritarianism. I guess because it had the ideology, and there it says that like the lack of ideology is important because it doesn't constrain yourself. That would be important, but on the other hand,
okay. It's indeed a bit tricky, but we'll sum it up now.
I think one of the main arguments of Korea-centrism in the book is in the name of the book. It's called spin dictatorship.
Yeah.
They make a distinction between a dictatorship of fear and dictatorship of lie. And they argue that all type of autocracies rely on mass repressions.
Yeah.
For example, the Soviet Union or Maoist China. while the new autocracies try to control people not through the sphere, but rather through confusion, through control of information, a relatively low level of repression. So if you look at Russia in 2010, you will see some political repressions, but overall they weren't that high.
Yeah, very good. Yes, please.
In terms of the low level of repressions, I think the fact that the ideology under informational authoritarianism isn't kind of directly coming from or overtly connected to the states. It can be manipulated by them, but I think, for example, in Russia, this idea of Russian culture, Russian expression that gets exported but also reinforced internally by kind of having these pro-Kremlin influences, for example, on social media, or kind of putting out this idea of ways in which Russia is a great place and supporters, that sort of control through other channels gets people to regurgitate a sympathetic ideology, but it's not coming directly from the state, so there's influence, indirect influence and control.
Let's take two final short comments, because I think we now have so much which we will try to put under the label of informational autocracy that we need some clarity.
I would say a big difference between the dictatorships, or I would say totalitarian or authoritarian regimes, name it, like the 20th century and the 21st century, is that in the last century, mostly these regimes wanted to create a new man somehow. I mean, the Soviet Union wanted to create somehow a new man, like Sovietsky человек, is like called, and like but like today it's more not like so much based on it that you want to create with a certain ideology something. You just mainly want to keep your power, and you can change your ideology when you want. And like, for example, Putin, when he came into power, he like said, yeah, we're gonna stay with the West. And then later, right now, he's like proclaiming the Russian world somehow. It's like, you can change the type.
And the final comment?
Just a quick question, how do we even, what's the definition in this case of ideology?
The definition of, let's go to this step by step. The definition of ideology is in most cases a systematic set of beliefs which a regime is trying to transpose onto its people. The moment, and this word systematic is the main reason why there is a lot of debate. I mean, with communism, it's clear, it's systematic. There is a book, there is another book, there are many, many volumes of Marx, Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Che Guevara, whoever, and because of that, you can argue there is a system behind this. With many other ideologies, this book is not so clear, and therefore there's always a debate whether this systemic quality is already reached or not. But for the purposes of informational autocracy, I mean, you went all in very different directions. Some of you went into the direction of information control. I mean, you did it the most, actually. You said, we want to stop people from finding out things which they are not supposed to find, through things like constraining travel abroad even, or constraining access to internet. Some of you focused on the lack of ideology, said, okay, Soviet Union creates a new man, Nazi Germany has the racist ideas the regime is based upon, Putinism kind of is not based on any ideas except staying in power, so it's not quite clear what the content of their propaganda is. And that is, I think, the point where the confusion with the Soviet Union starts. Now, informational autocracies are defined through two characteristics. Point one, they don't convey a specific, clear, systematic ideological message. They just don't do it. They don't try to convince their citizens in any form of ideology. Point two, they don't only have low level of repressiveness. Here I agree with you. They also don't engage in systematic, at least as wide scope as the old regimes, censorship. They do engage in some levels of censorship. Censorship is important for work with propaganda, but it's not comparable to the Soviet Union. They don't prohibit travel abroad. They allow you to get access to internet. What they do, instead of convincing you, they obfuscate you. They confuse you. An argument of Guriev and Treisman was, it's enough. You don't need to tell people Putin is a great leader. Somebody said that. That's what I call here minus ideology. It's enough to say that everybody is bad. You don't need to convince people that Russia is a great country. It's enough to convince that there are different doubts and positions and points of view of what makes a great country. You don't really need to convince people that people in Donbass all support Russian invasion. It's enough to show that there are different points of view on that. Yeah? The most famous argument of Russian propaganda is things are complicated, не всё так однозначно. And that's enough. And that's exactly what informational autocracy is about. And the power of informational autocracy is, as you all could imagine, seeding doubt is much easier than convincing. Yeah? Give me one seminar and I'll make sure I'll seed a lot of doubts in a lot of things you knew about authoritarian regimes. But I will not convince you in anything. Okay?
But isn't the fact that the Russian government is doing that already making it systematic?
It is systematic, but it's not a content. It's not a content which they communicate. They don't have an idea that authoritarian regimes, that would be something like we fundamentally disbelieve in knowledge. On the contrary, we say that we do believe in knowledge, and there is the right argument. We just want different arguments to debate, you know, and then we'll find out.
So is there necessarily a dichotomy between these two concepts? Because as far as I understand, an informational autocracy can still be electoral.
Of course. Yeah. And that's exactly what Russia was. Yeah. Russia before 2022 is an informational electoral autocracy. It's a regime which is drawing legitimacy from elections, which is obfuscating its citizens, and also not citizens, by the way, to the extent which it allows it to stay in power. And this mechanism, of course, is perfect if you want to sell yourself as democracy as well, because if you think about that, well, obfuscation also to some extent is present in democracies. So, Putin was actually proud to say we have much less ideology than Western countries because they have a convincing set of beliefs they want to sell to everybody. We don't have it. Yeah? So, and the important thing which was argued based on the Russian case, in particular Russian case, sorry, yeah, I see it, that electoral and informational autocracies are way more flexible and adaptable. They can do things traditional authoritarian regimes cannot. And because of that, Russia can have open borders, massive investments from abroad, internet, and still be, by the way, urbanized, educated population. That's, by the way, a big challenge for many authoritarian regimes, and still remain an autocracy.
Did this change after 2020?
I'll come to that in exactly 2 slides.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so the short answer is very complicated. Okay, so what I said now obviously doesn't mean that these type of regimes are, you know, invincible, perfect, have absolutely no problems. We can say, and at least that's what people would argue, electoral informational autocracies were good at maintaining power, but they also suffered from problems. They suffered from specific problems, and they suffered from problems which are more universal to authoritarian regimes. And I'm just briefly going through some of these problems before I come to the more interesting question, what's happening now? First of all, elections are a built-in point of instability in the system. You can tell your subjects as much as you want, elections are not the place where you elect. Still, there is a moment of time when people go to the ballot box and vote for somebody. And it is natural for all, both opposition leaders, but actually not that important in these systems in most cases, but also elite factions, to use this moment to think about, well, maybe some change is needed. Henry Hale even talks about cycles of regimes for this type of policies, because he argues that they always will look weaker at the moment of elections. So they receive information, they legitimize themselves, but they also build in a moment of weakness. It's, if you want to imagine, you do a boxing match, and every time and again you let your opponent hit you in the face, in the hope that actually you agreed with your opponent, the hit will be not very strong, so you'll have no problems with this. But still, you don't know. Maybe once your opponent will really hit you with full power. So there is always a constant risk. Not the risk that they're going to lose elections. This cannot happen. But risk that elections will become a moment of mobilization of opposition. And that occurred in quite a few of these regimes. Second, these type of regimes are quite dependent on output legitimacy. It's very easy to explain to people that things are complicated if things are relatively well. It's much more difficult to maintain the illusion of democratic facade and the manipulation of information if you have major economic crises. Because in this case, the level of dissatisfaction of big groups can be so large and the ability to mobilize protests so high that you'll need to do something. And this something will typically be repressions, which either one of the regimes cannot use, because if you arrest your opponents, you're not an electoral regime and you're not informational autocracy. They are very limited in terms of their ability to mobilize people towards larger goals. Interests of autocrats in these regimes are limited to pure power preservation, but sometimes autocrats also want to achieve specific policy goals, like, conquer a neighboring country. And in this situation, when you want to achieve sufficient mobilization, it could become difficult. Because for that, you actually would need an ideology. And one more comment, these regimes actually are not so good at governing. Well, Russia did improve the quality of bureaucracy over the last decade quite a lot. But at the same time, all of these regimes have a built-in problem with the bureaucratic quality. They prefer loyalty over competence. The argument is actually quite simple. Since competent bureaucrats are more likely to defect because they're less dependent on the regime, it is easier for the regime to rely on incompetent but loyal bureaucrats. Yeah? Quite simply, a competent minister of finance will be employed by the next regime as well. Therefore, this person will be less interested in defending the current regime. An incompetent minister of finance will not be employed by the next regime, so this person will be very interested in defending what we have now. And finally, I told you kind of with half a sentence, there is also the third branch of research, which comes not from the post-Soviet Eurasia, but from China, focusing on institutional authoritarian regimes with power sharing. No post-Soviet case actually achieved this. All of them remained highly personalistic. So essentially Stroessners, but not in military uniform, but with a smartphone and a lot of information manipulation and pseudo-elections all the time. And these type of personalist regimes have problems, at least two. Problem number one, they're very bad at succession, because when the president dies or goes away, it's not clear what will happen. And second, they're very prone to incorrect, irrational decisions made by the paramount leader, because a lot of decisions are made just by one guy. As a matter of fact, this is a reason why at least some of these regimes will experience things which the theoretical argument would not expect them to do, but I'll come to that in a moment. So we have post-Soviet Eurasia, where we have at least several very prominent examples of electoral informational autocracies. Most prominent being Russia. Second one, actually as prominent but less studied, being Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is the closest neighbor of Russia on the typology of political regimes. Essentially Russia without anti-Westernism, if I put it in one sentence. Which, as it turns out today, is actually a very clever move. So, over time, and because of that, it appears like we have systems which, first of all, found the holy grail of survival with relatively low costs and more or less recognition of the outside world. This recognition is not just symbolically important, it's a source of rents. And also in all of these regimes, we observe kind of what I would call nuclei of more advanced and open political order. You have processes of economic development. You have bureaucratic improvements, in spite of the things I told you before. We have universities which are internationally competitive. Actually, Russia and Kazakhstan had best universities in the post-Soviet Eurasia, better than Ukraine. Far better than democratic Ukraine, because their leadership could invest a lot of money in these universities. And actually, Russia put enormous money in studying Russian authoritarianism. That's the reason we know it so well. Many of the results I'm showing you today come from studies financed by the Russian government. part of informational autocracy. You want to sell that you are democratic, that you are successful also in scientific progress. So from this point of view, a top publication on Russian authoritarianism is as good as any. And from this point of view, the perception of many was that these systems are at least not degrading to the old classical authoritarianisms of the Stroessner and Politburo type, with mass repressions, with open ideologization, with clear information controls. And I think the biggest problem we have after the full-scale invasion is this assumption actually turned out to be wrong. Russia, which appeared to be a very, very successful electoral informational autocracy, in extremely rapid way, appears to transform itself into a much more traditional authoritarian regime, taking on board all the problems of traditional authoritarian regimes. Since 2022, Russia had a massive increase in the scope of repressions. There are those who say repressions are larger than repressions of the Brezhnev era. That's a bad comparison. Brezhnev had a very stable authoritarian system, so he didn't need to repress so many Soviet citizens. Stalin did it for him, if you want. Putin still has to do it. So for a regime which is in the state of transition, the level of repressions is still not that which some of these regimes had. Nevertheless, much, much higher level of repressions. So the number of victims of political prosecution in Russia is not hundreds. It's tens of thousands. Much more direct and open information control. Today in Russia, access to many oppositional websites and newspaper is either prohibited or there's a lot of effort to prohibit it. The work of independent journalists is restricted. So the information flow is much more open. And there is trend towards ideologization. Modern Russia is, well, at least appears to be like a state which wants to construct an ideology. And some most obvious examples of that is the change of school and university curricula. Because that's the moment when ideology comes into play. I'm sorry. At this moment, you try to convey the systematic set of beliefs to school children and to university students. So it appears that a system which was a stable and successful solution as opposed to traditional authoritarian regimes, and at the same time even had nuclei of more efficient political order, rapidly going back to much more traditional authoritarianism.
Is that maybe because the situation just changed? Because before it worked because it was, well, it wasn't peace because there was war in Chechnya and in Georgia, no war on the scale as in Ukraine, and then once the invasion of Ukraine completely failed from the Russian side, they needed to improvise something to keep the country together, and that's why they went back to the old school methods of keeping an autocracy alive.
Let's collect points for points of view on what's happening, okay? So that is exactly the question I wanted to ask to you. So your argument is essentially, it is a consequence of miscalculation. You have a stable, effective informational electoral autocracy. It makes one giant mistake, and the only chance to survive is stop being informational electoral autocracy to become more traditional autocracy. Because you need enough cannon fodder on the front lines, you need more control over people in the country, and so on. All right, that's one possible explanation. Maybe I'll just make here one small remark and then I'll collect other explanations from you guys. China, which was also seen like a modern autocracy, institutional autocracy, roughly about the same time also starts degrading into classical personalist autocracies. So it looks like all these, if you want, advancements in authoritarian fashion were not for long. Yeah?
I would like more say like the repressions in Russia are more like increased by the government. I mean, like they could have, like for example, closed all the all the opposition newspapers before the war already. They had like the resources, everything. They had like they have like all the like security on their side and everything, but they didn't do. And then they closed it, and I think it was mainly like to consolidate their power. Like within, and also like the image of an enemy, of the inner enemy. against which you have to fight. And because Putin himself, he said, like, we need to clean the Russian society, like 2 months after the war started. He said, like, every enemy will be spitted out like a fly in my mouth, or something like that, I think he said.
All right, that's similar to the argument of your colleague. Essentially, it's external shock.
Yeah, but before the war, Russia, like, if they would have closed newspapers and so on before the war, I think there would have been maybe some uprising, something in civil society. But the war gave him justification to do exactly that, to clean Russia from the inside or whatever.
That's the opposite argument. Your argument is essentially what we observe now in Russia is a logical step in evolution of the regime. So what appeared to be institutional electoral autocracy was just the necessary solution is not what's happening now. The necessary solution is what was happening before. They would love to have ideology and repressions before 2022, they just didn't dare. Now they do.
Quite a new thought for me even. Maybe it's somehow connected to the COVID, and as it was such a draft of how the country can survive without external connections, how society can completely be okay with the norms given from above, to stay at home, no riots allowed, and they are still not allowed in Russia, just as you said about the press and that thing is just they had this period of time where they could try implementing some new norms, and they have seen that it worked.
I mean, let's remember the word COVID. It will be important in our future discussion.
Yeah.
Let's keep it in mind.
I would also agree with this internal mechanism that government still needs some support and legitimacy, and I think for Putin his support rating support percentage is very important. You could see that as one of the explanations why he started the war against Ukraine in 2014 and 15, because his ratings dropped after the protests, and in context of COVID his ratings dropped again. So maybe the reason is that the government needs constant legitimacy sources, and one of the sources of legitimacy is war against Ukraine, which Putin expected to be quick, Kyiv in 3 days, and it didn't work. So in that case, you cannot be as open informational autocracy as you were.
Okay, so essentially you're again in the crowd of those who say it's a consequence of specific foreign policy decision.
Foreign policy decision which came from the necessity to maintain legitimacy.
Fair enough. I mean, foreign policy decisions always are driven by domestic concerns, I would say, different types of domestic concerns, or by beliefs about optimal foreign policies. So for us, it's not important why Putin invaded Ukraine. That's a different debate. For us, it's important why Russia, after invasion, started to transform in the way it started. And here I think you side with the guys who are saying, well, you cannot have a war and informational electoral autocracy. Doesn't work.
I mean, we also sort of had this discussion in our seminar on Monday, where I also thought, like, okay, since the war started, like, employing certain ideological mechanisms can be quite beneficial to the regime because it can sort of consolidate the power, the grip of people that are supposed to be loyal to you, and kind of give out the party line. But then also your counterpoint to that was that there's certain ideological entrepreneurs within society, within the regime, that have sort of obviously the line of the government, but go beyond that and want a certain ideology to be put in place by the regime. So they go out and say these like quite radical things. Say, okay, we need to restore, and well, not necessarily Putin wants exactly to be so outspoken like that, because there is a certain reason why we had this minus ideology before the regime. There's certainly still that intent to keep sort of that balance. But I would argue that it's sort of like a call and response mechanism, where obviously, like, you have these political entrepreneurs that want to push that, and prefers not to do that. But obviously he will still, to some extent, agree with the points mentioned by these entrepreneurs and builds on that, because he's still a pragmaticist. Okay, that's kind of something useful that I can afford to stay in power to push my line of thought. So it's like sort of like a communicative process. You allow a certain degree of ideology to be developed, pushed, but there's limits.
I mean, that's a different explanation, by the way. We'll also have that. So this is a very good one. I'll take it on board. Yes, please.
I'd probably say something more similar to that. Like, I don't think that the shift in Russia since 2022, which is a nice timeline point to put on the map, obviously, but it's too simple to say, you know, it's either as a consequence of Ukraine or Ukraine was an excuse for it. I think it's to do with how does this ideology of make Russia great again, you might say, become taken, but like how is it forwarded? And I think we'll see the political climate in the US with after Trump's first term and now his second term is maybe an emboldening factor. But as we move towards this more multipolar world, the autocracies which exist feel that they're able to double down and become more openly autocratic rather than just the electoral informational autocracies that had to be, that were accepted in the kind of 2010s.
I'll take this on board. We'll talk about this as well. Yes, please.
I mean, I share mostly what has been said. I would, however, also situate it, like the situation, in a more global trend of rise of authoritarian characteristics. Not necessarily among autocracies, but among all regimes, including democracies, since I would say at least the great financial crisis and then most especially since the COVID pandemic. Like, I think that Russian economy is not going well, but it's a case of global economy, and for me it's also one key component explaining the rise of authoritarian tendencies, not only in Russia but more globally.
I don't know if we are talking about a more global perspective. I think that we have to go back a little bit more even, because I think what also legitimized a lot of our authoritarian regimes or authoritarians is also that the global West or democracy still did business with them, still do business with them, are still legitimizing them, considering what in the case of Syria or in the case of Afghanistan with the Taliban. I think this, if we go back even 2 decades or 3 decades, then you could start, because people criticized very early on Nord Stream 2 and many businesses that were done with Russia, but the West or other countries still kept doing businesses. So.
Okay, yes please.
Yeah,
then
I agree, and not only they kept doing businesses, but they progressively also integrated in their some authoritarian characteristics.
Very good. Let's distinguish between, I think, 4 arguments which we've had so far. One argument comes from you guys, and you're essentially saying it's because the West is itself becoming authoritarian, or it's open to dealing with autocracies, and because of that, it does support authoritarian tendencies in the non-Western part of the world. I think it's an interesting idea, but that's not about what we're talking about here. Because we are not talking about things becoming more authoritarian. This is a very important point. I quite consciously didn't say Russia became more authoritarian after 2022. Russia is as authoritarian as it was, because definition of authoritarian is not free and fair elections for which power can change. There was no free and fair elections in Russia in 2012, in 2018, and there is none in 2025. From this point of view, absolutely nothing changed. Russia remained and remains an authoritarian regime, at least throughout the period I'm talking about. What changes is specific mechanisms the regime uses to protect its power. But from this point of view, the fact that the West integrates these types of regimes actually should serve, and a lot of people argued back then it would serve, as a counterweight towards this development. Because the fact that we do business with you, okay, Taliban, sure, but Taliban is also not the most beloved partner of the West, let's put it like that. In most cases, the West was very happy to deal with authoritarian regimes which behave geopolitically, but that's a common part of these things because it's never about only regime characteristics, it's also about good old power politics, and behaved in terms of how they operated at home. There is one wonderful example. As you all know, I think in 2015, sanctions against Belarus were lifted by the European Union. And I had a chance back then to talk with an employee of the European Commission who told me that he admires what's happening there. He really sees Belarusian bureaucrats, they really want to change things. How they really wanted to change things, we've seen in 2020, I think. But why were sanctions lifted? Quite simple. Belarus played nice at the moment of elections. So no mass repressions at the moment of elections. Belarus, as we all know, very, very good at playing nice to get concessions from sanctions. I mean, that's what Lukashenko doing even today with release of political prisoners. And Belarus became a playing card in relations with Russia. So, essentially, the fact that authoritarian regimes become more openly repressive and ideological makes it way more difficult for the West to offer them what the West is offering to them, also because of domestic pressures. So if these regimes would be interested in these benefits, they would not have changed in the way they changed. On the opposite, they would remain authoritarian, there's no doubt about this, but they would remain informational electoral. Because that would be the perfect combination. And a lot of people thought that's exactly what Putin is up to. He wants to get maximum benefits from the relations with the West, at the same time staying in power. The same applies to Western authoritarian tendencies. Again, the Western authoritarian tendencies, even with the Trump administration or whatever, it's under no conditions justifies the reversal to the classical authoritarianism. It justifies the persistence of informational electoral autocracies, maybe, depending upon how you evaluate the situation in the West. But it doesn't tell that, classical repressions are now more acceptable scenario. So these external factors, at least as an explanation for my question, don't appear to be very helpful.
Yeah, I didn't mean to bring the global trends as a way to justify regimes, but more to say, okay, something is going on, and it might also come from the economic situation that those regimes say the economy is going worse and worse. There is probably no, in the short or middle term, good solution. We should give ourselves tools to domesticate our own population.
Here we indeed do have an important argument because the old equilibrium was based on more or less functioning economic situation. Here I absolutely agree. But let me briefly scroll through a possible set of explanations which we have here. The first explanation I have on this slide is, exactly the one you guys started with, the foreign policy explanation. It's saying that it's sure, we can look at aggressiveness of Russian foreign policy as a function of domestic politics. At least in the case of Crimea, it's most likely was the case. For the case of full-scale invasion, it's more complicated. But another effect should also be explored. And if you have a country which is engaging major confrontation with the West, for whatever reasons, out of strategic miscalculations, personal beliefs of Putin, deep ideological beliefs, but it doesn't matter. What's important is engaging these confrontation. And that is also equally important, a country where the securitization of foreign policy becomes more important. That is, everything happening outside Russia's borders is more or less interpreted as a threat to national security. You have no choice but to reverse to traditional, more open authoritarian regimes. So, from this point of view, the war is an important, at least trigger, and maybe a decisive factor why a regime is starting to change. Which may even appear an optimistic point of view because it means if the war is over, things could change back. We can put a lot of question marks on that, but at least that's one possible interpretation. Another interpretation, I think one which was present in some of you, was exactly the opposite one. And this says, what we have here is the persistence of political practices and ideas which existed in these societies from the very start. So essentially we say there are tendencies in Russian political life which support the development of authoritarian regimes. Sometimes it's done through the concept of Homo Sovieticus. Homo Sovieticus is a very questionable concept, questionable to the boundary of being non-scientific. Gulnaz Sharafudinova has a very convincing article about that. Sometimes we don't use it, but we still say, okay, there are long-term trends, so just Putin is just playing out these trends. Especially among historians, there are quite a few who try to trace February 2022 towards longer developments of Russian politics. The obvious problem with this type of explanation is essentialist. Essentialism, that is ascribing Russia certain unchangeable characteristics, is, from the point of view of empirical research, A, reductionist, simplistic, and B, non-testable. Because of that, essentialist explanations are actually out of fashion in social sciences. But it is one of the arguments which is put here to essentially say repressions under Putin are very similar to repressions which Russia experienced historically. We just go back to where we started. The third argument is this is an illusion of regress. And that's essentially what some of you said, I think you have said. This is the argument that the whole electoral informational autocracy was just a temporary period in the development of authoritarian regime. Regime actually was interested in maintaining the classical authoritarian regime. It never dared, and now it dares, and because of that we observe what we see here. The next argument is a sustainability of electoral and informational autocracies. They work only under certain conditions, and they depend on very particular economic and social environment. At least in case of Russia, the major challenge would be here the modernizing society. Russian urban society was modernizing at very rapid pace, accepting new values, new norms, new types of behavior. And what have worked in 2000 stopped working in 2012. And definitely stopped working in 2020. And from this point of view, regime at some point of time was doomed to go back to the old ways, because you cannot run a modern society through this approach. Ella Paniak likes to talk, at that moment of time, liked to talk about modern society and archaic regime in Russia. Notice it's exactly the opposite to one of the arguments I had in the previous slide, which says it's all about long-term societal characteristics. And finally, global trends, but my global trends are very different from yours. My global trends are not related to Trump and to Western democracies.
Well, what I meant by that is that I think Russia is imperialistic, and when I said make Russia great again, you know, it's I meant in terms of those imperialist aims, which, and when you are trying to propagate imperialism internally, you may turn towards a different form of authoritarianism in order to action that.
That is an argument we had before. That's an argument about historical legacies, about the existence of some persistent shapes of behavior in Russian way of thought, in Russian society, in Russian government. In this case, you focus on the foreign policy behavior, that is imperialism, which justifies or necessitates certain type of political governance. As I said, the problem, it's essentialism. Essentialism is very, very questionable approach in social sciences. To say Russia is imperialistic is possible only with...
Historical evidence of which there is quite...
I mean, the very idea that you call an entity which is so big and heterogeneous as a whole state with one adjective is essentialism.
We could unpack it, but I sense there's not time.
Also,
no, we don't.
Essentialism is a very pessimistic way of view, because it means that you cannot change it. It stays.
I mean, pessimism has right to exist. We all die at some point of time.
From our perspective, if you say that Russia is never going to change, then we should just put a fence across Russia and never touch this country again.
Okay, it may be pessimistic, it may be politically unoptimal, but that's not my question here. My question here is unscientific.
I want to move from the discussion on essentialism, and I have actually a question regarding the second argument, problems with dealing with modernizing society.
Mm-hmm.
You also mentioned that, by modernizing society, you mean people, highly educated people in urban areas. I think there was some study where the surveys showed that actually the most nationalist feminists are also excluded by this group?
It depends how you define nationalism. This we also need to know, because as you remember, historically, nationalism and demand for democratic transition are actually very closely linked to each other.
Okay, ethnic nationalism.
Ethnic nationalism. I'd like to see this data, because I haven't seen that.
Okay.
To say that more educated urban groups in Russia are also those characterized by highest level of xenophobia,
I think it was in the paper Faces of Power course. I will look it up.
I mean, there are studies for sure, which show different types of behavior of these groups.
So how does this connect? Isn't then ethnic nationalism kind of beneficial?
Yeah, but ethnic nationalism is also not necessarily linked to the type of traditional authoritarianism.
Okay. So
Ethnic nationalism.
There is not this link that could.
Exactly.
Okay.
Ethnic nationalism is content. Ethnic nationalism is a specific set of beliefs about society. Traditional authoritarianism is mechanism through which you run the society. You can have, and actually you do have, ethnic nationalist parties in democratic countries, even in power, right? But they do not run these countries using the tools of traditional authoritarianism, because these are not traditional authoritarian states. So this is actually the most important message, if you want, which I will have to give you from this class. And if maybe at this moment of time I'll just finish what I'm talking about, and then I'll give the floor to questions, because otherwise we will not be done. We need to distinguish between institutions and mechanisms and content, ideologies, beliefs, specific things regimes want to achieve. You can have a traditional repressive authoritarian regime which is constructing pro-American market economy, Pinochet. Whether you can have it in Russia, it's a different question. But generally speaking, you can have it. You can have a highly nationalistic, xenophobic, democratic country starting genocide. We had multiple cases of that in Africa, where actually there's a correlation, and man and his dark side of democracy makes it clearly clear between democratic transition and ethnic cleansings. These are two different things. What I'm talking about here is just mechanisms, okay? All right, but maybe I'll just quickly finish what I'm talking about here, because then we'll have time for, actually we don't have time for questions, but I'm still happy to answer them. Because there are at least two other things which I'll try to pack in the last 2 minutes of my presentation. So we have 5 arguments why at least Russian politics experiences regress. Essentialism, historical legacy, coincidence, effect of the war, unsustainability of this type of rule in more modern societies, a kind of natural logic of evolution of the regime, and also closer cooperation to other authoritarian regimes. That's what I wanted to highlight, because this is of course very important in the sense of authoritarian learning. Some regimes copying what's existing in other cases. At the same time, and now I'm going back to your question, you said, but I'd like to know what exactly is happening now in Russia. The problem is that the argument that Russia is experiencing this regress away from electoral and informational autocracies is actually debatable. There is no consensus on that. And there is no consensus on that because there are quite a few observers of the Russian case who say, well, the changes we talk about are not as essential for the regime as one would believe. Putinism remains electoral informational autocracy. Russia wages a war, but it isolates big parts of its society from the war. Russia needs soldiers to the front line. It doesn't create ideology to recruit them, it just pays them a lot of money. Which from the point of view of these modern autocracies is the best solution. Because those who want to take the money and fight. Those who don't want to take the money stay at home and can continue being there. It is a society where there is a very, very cautious attitude towards politicization of big groups. So one is very, very cautious about ideology or lack thereof. It is a society where bureaucracy is not really adapted to the realities of classical authoritarianism, traditional authoritarianisms. And then, if we put it from this point of view, what we need to look at are kind of nuclei of the change towards the new, more traditional authoritarianism in Russia. And there are some. For example, the way how the Russian state treats LGBTQ people is clearly ideological. So you can see it as an ideological element in the political system which is much more close to traditional ideological autocracies. Or the school education, the so-called talking about the important classes, the разговоры о важном, the mandatory ideological education at schools, can also be seen as kind of an attempt to make the system more ideological. The question is actually what is happening in real Russian schools if they talk about the important. There is some research, they talk about different stuff, but I'll leave it here. The same applies to repressions. Repressions in modern Russia are way more developed than it was before the war, before the full-scale invasion. At the same time, most Russians are still not subject to direct threat of repressions. And actually, you mentioned COVID. COVID is a perfect example of what Russian state did not dare to do. Russian state, which can wage a war, didn't dare coerce big part of the population to wear masks, through a more or less systematic set of measures, which in Germany were applied with full coercive power as a state, as we know. It didn't coerce its subjects into accepting the best Russian vaccine, Sputnik. Yeah? So at that moment of time, the regime appeared not at all as reverting to old ways, but very, very cautious of not crossing the border. It didn't even coerce its citizens not to go to church, knowing that churches are places of infection. It even didn't dare telling the citizens that they shouldn't go to church. So from this point of view, possibly Russian regime didn't really change so much. What changed is the perception of the regime. A country which is waging a war against its neighbor, an aggressive war, but still electoral informational autocracy. I'm over time, but if you allow me to take one more minute, I have to give a counter-argument to this argument as well, and then I'm done. Some say, well, maybe Russia today is still not there. But the question is not whether Russia is today, but where it's going to be in 5 or 10 years. What is the development trajectory of Russia? And here, it appears that while Russia today may still be informational electoral autocracy, there are inner logics of the regime which drive it more and more towards classical dictatorships. One of them is political entrepreneurs. If somebody sits today in a bureaucratic decision-making process in Russia and says, we need more ideological education at schools, we need mass youth organizations, we need patriotic messaging via radio, whatever, who would dare to say no? And there are enough people who always said that. In the past, they either were perceived as freaks or not listened to. Now they're listened to. There may be at some point of time growing public dissatisfaction. We don't really observe it now, but things could change. And then again, direct repressions and big wave of repressions will be necessary. And finally, this all leaves out the personal preferences of one guy, Vladimir Putin. Maybe he likes the new youth pioneer organization and ideological education kindergartens. The last actually he does like, as it appears to be. He made a statement about that. But from this point of view, it may be that Russia is in any way on the way to the traditional dictatorship. It's just not arrived there. The judgment is still out. We don't know where the development is going to be, nonetheless, because we don't have decent empirical data on the current Russia. But this is at least a topic which one ought to discuss. So I had one more slide on other authoritarian regimes in Eurasia, which I don't have time to talk about. But it would be actually a very simple argument. As I said, Kazakhstan is very, very similar to Russia in many instances. Azerbaijan and Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan are much closer to traditional model. And Belarus is really interesting because Belarus is way more ideological than Russian state. And actually, the ideologization of Belarusian regime worked in a way by rejecting the way how Russia developed in the 1990s. If you want the main message Lukashenko sold to its people, quite successfully until 2020, is that Belarus is much better Russia. Quiet, with fair distribution of salaries and incomes, no wars, no crisis, everything is great. In 2020, it stopped working. And now the convergence to the Russian case is much more rapid. And I have one sentence about Georgia, which I actually don't know what to say about. Because if Georgia will become an authoritarian regime, it will be extremely unusual for the post-Soviet cases. It will be entirely different evolution, entirely different trajectory, and well, at least the party's regime, we didn't have it before. So, sorry for taking too much of your time. I conclude. Post-Soviet Eurasia is a great case for studying authoritarian regimes. It was a case for constructing modern theory of authoritarianism. It is now the case for debunking modern theory of authoritarianism. How successful this debunking is going on, or maybe the theories will emerge victorious out of this process, remains to be seen. Thank you very much. Again, I'm very sorry for taking more of your time, so this is the moment when we stop. But if you have questions, you can still ask me. I'm happy to answer.